If you've ever been taught how English orthography works, then you're fully aware that it isn't a very well-designed system. Kernel, ginkgo, one, you know all the common examples. It's pretty much mandatory for me to bring this one up. Did you know that you can spell fish, G-H-O-T-I, and it would be consistent with English spelling? I mean, you can't. That's definitely not how English spelling works. G-H and T-I are only f and sh in specific contexts. You could, however, spell fish P-F-Y-S-C-H-E, and that would be consistent with English spelling. Oh, and if you're okay with ignoring context, we can all agree that the T-I in nation is absolutely too tame, right? Might I suggest the C-H-S-I in fuchsia instead? Despite everything, I don't think it's fair to claim that English spelling is broken, or even that it's unusually irregular. Could it be better? Yes, absolutely, but for the most part you can pretty easily derive pronunciation from spelling. And sure, you absolutely would not be able to guess from pronunciation alone that, say, phlegm is spelled P-H-L-E-G-M, but that doesn't mean it's a bad spelling. You could probably guess that the G is silent, because in English, whenever the spelling implies a consonant cluster that isn't allowed phonotactically, normally the first consonant is dropped, and keeping the silent G in the word helps show the connection to phlegmatic. So English orthography isn't perfect, but it's definitely good enough. That hasn't stopped a whole lot of people from trying to fix it anyway. I'm Jan Measley, and most English spelling reforms are bad. Part 1. What a spelling reform is. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. What exactly do I mean by spelling reform? A spelling reform is a proposed change to, or complete replacement for, the spelling rules of a language's orthography, in this case, English. Due to the perceived problems with English spelling as it currently exists, there have been a lot of ideas for how to fix it. I classify English spelling reforms into three main groups. The first group consists of complete aesthetic overhauls to English spelling. This includes fully new alphabets made for English, or any system for writing English with the Latin alphabet that doesn't take how the Latin alphabet is normally used, in English or otherwise, into consideration. These reforms don't burden themselves with needing to consider people's expectations of what written English should look like. And as a result, they tend to be very functional, making it very easy to derive spelling from pronunciation and vice versa. These would also be the most difficult to actually implement as a theoretical replacement for English spelling. Nobody wants to learn a new alphabet or unlearn everything they know about the alphabet they're already using. The second type of English spelling reform is the dual of the first, preserving most of the current English orthography, only replacing individual words that are deemed too irregular, or groups of words that are all irregular in the same way. These are the least effective type of spelling reform in terms of practicality, putting a band-aid on the problems with English orthography without really changing how it works underlyingly, and inversely are the most effective in terms of actually being implemented. Every English spelling reform that has had any amount of success in the history of modern English has been in this category, most notably the one made by Noah Webster. While not all of Webster's ideas caught on, the ones that did became the distinct features of American English spelling we know today. The third type of spelling reform is those that are somewhere between the first two. These are spelling reforms that rebuild English orthography from the ground up, but in a way that's meant to be intuitive to those who are familiar with the current system. If done well, one of these reforms could have the best properties of both of the first two types, being fully regular without requiring English speakers to relearn everything. If done poorly, one of these reforms could have the worst properties of the first two types, being completely incomprehensible to anyone unfamiliar with its rules while inheriting many of the inconsistencies from the current orthography. These spelling reforms are the most interesting type, and the most fun to make. As a result, there are a lot of them. English-speaking conlangers especially tend to enjoy making them, often with secondary goals like ASCII compatibility or maximizing how many words are spelled the same in the new system. Part 2. Where most spelling reforms go wrong. There are a few specific common mistakes that I see a lot looking at different spelling reforms. One that's embarrassingly common is where a spelling reform is presented as though it actually has a chance of becoming the new default way of writing English. Maybe this was possible to achieve a few centuries ago, but it's definitely impossible now. Even the reforms that acknowledge that fully replacing English spelling with a new system made by someone on the internet would be completely impossible almost always have some portion of their description spent going over the potential benefits of making the switch, as though people are actually going to do that. And I get why they all do this. It's so they can justify having made their spelling reform, even though the actual reason is usually because making an English spelling reform is just a fun design challenge. It's really fun to look at English spelling and say to yourself, yeah, I could do better, and then have a go at actually trying to do better. This usually is entirely a problem with presentation, but there are some reforms that genuinely were created with the intention of replacing English spelling, and if that's not what you actually want, then you should be completely clear about that. And of course, if that is what you actually want, then you're setting yourself up for failure, because again, it's an impossible goal. Another issue concerns how the multitude of English dialects are handled. English is spoken by a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and a truly phonetic writing system for English would have to take all of those different ways into account. This leads to one of two situations, neither of which is ideal. Option 1 is having the new standard spellings of words take into account the different ways those words can be pronounced. This effectively leads to requiring everyone to memorize how every word is spelled individually, which is exactly how English spelling already works, so this option isn't very helpful. Option 2 is allowing words to be spelled in multiple ways, reflecting their multiple pronunciations. This is better, but it means that every dialect of English has its own separate written form, fragmenting the written language. You could also just not bother and enforce one specific dialect of English as the standard, which is unambiguously worse than either option, so no matter what you do, this is going to cause some problems. Outside of these nearly universal fundamental structural problems, there's a few specific design choices I see a lot that I just don't like personally. A lot of spelling reforms try to be compatible with the ASCII character set. This is a reasonable thing to want, but it's completely impossible for an English spelling reform to be fully phonetic in a way that looks good while also being ASCII compatible. You can make an ASCII compatible system that looks good, and you can make an ASCII compatible system that's fully phonetic, but you can't have all three. Now, what I actually mean by a spelling reform looking good is obviously going to be different from what other people think looks good. So like, this looks better to me than this, which looks better to me than this. Each of these ways of spelling the same word has its own unique aesthetic. None of them look very much like English, but my preference is definitely towards the ones that look more languagey in general. One little thing that definitely ends up being super important is the way the schwa vowel is written. The reduced is the most common vowel in English, so it's important to get it right, and most reforms that use the Latin alphabet do not get it right. A large number of English speakers merge schwa with the strut lexical set, myself included. Now, the strut lexical set is usually written in English with the letter U, so it makes sense to write it that way in a spelling reform. However, if you use U to write schwa, the results look absolutely terrible. The dilemma is that things that work for strut don't work for schwa, and vice versa. So if you're set on writing them the same way, one of them has to be written unintuitively. The solution, of course, is to not write them the same way. Schwa only appears in unstressed syllables, and the strut vowel only appears in stressed syllables, so it's not that difficult to tell them apart, even if you pronounce them the same way. On the topic of vowels, English's long vowels tend to be handled pretty inelegantly in spelling reforms. There's this temptation to try to preserve the relationships between the vowels that were long-short pairs in Middle English, like the fleece vowel being the long version of the dress vowel. As we all know, the Great Vowel Shift made it so that these historic pairs no longer sound very much like each other. It makes more sense in modern English to consider the fleece vowel to be the long version of the kit vowel instead, for example. Preserving these archaic pairs does have its advantages, namely that it allows some words to be spelled more closely to their current standard spelling. The problem comes when someone decides that a Middle Englishy way of spelling a vowel should be the only way to spell it. Invariably, words that are currently spelled in ways that make sense with modern English vowels always look worse when respelled according to imaginary Middle English pronunciation than words spelled in ways that make sense with Middle English vowels do when respelled according to modern English pronunciation. Tofu with double O looks worse than soon with double U. Kiwi with double E looks worse than green with double I. Cafe with AY looks worse than pay with EY. Any of the myriad of potential issues that come from using the Latin alphabet in a spelling reform can be completely sidestepped by creating a fully new writing system instead. A solution that works so well that it's basically cheating. A spelling system can't be unintuitive if nobody learning it has any intuitions for it. Now the question is, what would I do? Part 3. The Fun Riform. I have made a lot of spelling reforms. Or at least I've started and abandoned a lot of spelling reforms. The ones I've actually published, I largely created as jokes, like the etymological spelling reform I made that was briefly mentioned on the Lingthusiasm podcast that one time. The other spelling reforms I've worked on, I either decided partway through designing them that I didn't like them, or decided shortly after completing them that I didn't like them. In fact, it's my own experience with creating so many spelling reforms that allowed me to better understand how I feel about what works and does not work. Earlier this year, I created my first spelling reform that I am actually satisfied with. It's called the Fun Riform. My goals are for it to be a fully defined Latin script orthography for English that's possible to comprehensively describe on one screen of plain text, to be intuitive enough that an English speaker who doesn't already know how it works can still read text written in it, versatile enough to be able to handle any dialect of English, aesthetically pleasing to me personally, and fun to use. So how did I do? Well, what you're looking at now is a full description of the Fun Riform and how it works. I won't go over everything here, but there's a link in the description to my full definition of the reform on sexmal.net. So that's the first two goals achieved. As for how intuitive it is, here's the north wind and the sun. I'll let you be the judge for how easy this is to read. It's worth noting that since one of the goals is versatility, there's a practically unlimited number of ways that this text could have been transcribed into the Fun Riform. And yes, I do think that this looks pretty good, and that I have fun using it. So the Fun Riform achieves everything it set out to achieve. Great, but that doesn't mean it's perfect, just that it does what I wanted it to do. And there's some things that the Fun Riform does that I know other people wouldn't like. Some parts of it are intentionally ambiguous, like how th is used for both dental fricatives, and how ng could either be one or two sounds. There's also rules that serve no practical purpose that are only there to make things look nicer, like how any word that ends with a voiced fricative has a silent E inserted after it. The Fun Riform also has a built-in lack of standardization. One of the most important rules is that if a word looks wrong to you, then it is wrong, and you should spell it differently. This means that, in theory, every single person using the Fun Riform could be using it completely differently from everybody else. Other people might look at these aspects of the Fun Riform and conclude that it's a bad spelling reform, and I think I'm okay with that, because to me, they're key features of what I wanted the Fun Riform to be like. I mean, it's right in the name. This is a spelling reform that I just made for fun, so I don't have to worry about if other people like it as long as I'm happy with it. And I am. Part 4. The Perfect Spelling Reform. Epik. To be completely honest, the ideal spelling reform for English wouldn't look much like the Fun Riform. If the goal is to actually replace English spelling, then the perfect spelling reform wouldn't even be something that looks like a reform at all. The perfect spelling reform for English would be for English speakers globally to agree that it's okay to misspell things. There isn't an organization regulating the English language. Nobody is in charge of how it works. It's completely up to the speakers. The only thing getting in the way of English spelling becoming more regular is the idea that any given word has one correct spelling. If every English speaker decided to stop correcting each other's spelling mistakes and to disable autocorrect and spell check, all irregularities in English spelling would disappear within a single generation. If you consistently can't remember how to spell a word, it's not your fault. It's that word's fault, and you as an English speaker have the power to change it. Almost nobody spells hiccup with O-U-G-H anymore. Minuscule with an I is replacing minuscule with a U, and more recently through and though have gained alternate spellings that indisputably make more sense than their standard spellings. So English doesn't really need a spelling reform to fix the irregularities in its orthography. If you want English spelling to be better, there is absolutely nothing stopping you from making it better yourself. Thanks for watching. I've been Jan Miesely, and amateur is spelled with T-U-R-E. Blackgill. I'm a bit excited because Blackgill has so many vowels, there's so many vowels, looks like this Blackgill. I'm a bit excited because this episode is a first in a few ways. Blackgill.